Now, are you looking for a very lucrative new add-on service for your private investigations business? Well, if you do surveillance, then adding on counter surveillance may be an easy to add product for your clients. Counter surveillance would consist of working with your client to see if anybody is surveilling them. Now, there's different levels of counter surveillance, from the more basic, which is what we're going to discuss in this video, to full-blown TSCM or technical surveillance countermeasures, which involves an investment of many thousands of dollars in some very high-tech equipment. Staying focused on the more basic counter surveillance, why would you want to add this to your portfolio of products? The first thing that you should do is see if it fits well in your company. What other services do you offer? Who are your clients, and would this complement or complicate your current business? It might not be a good fit if you do primarily only surveillance for insurance companies. This could lead to many issues, to include a conflict of interest as well, client confidentiality, and would be a direct violation to most PI licensing rules and laws out there. What other reasons might bring about a conflict of interest or reason to not add counter surveillance to your list of provided services? Can you think of any? This video is sponsored by OREP Insurance and Working PI Magazine. OREP is a leading provider of private investigator liability insurance. Visit orep.org for a quote today. Now, if you're like me and you have done a lot of surveillance in the past, then you have a huge advantage over many PIs in doing counter surveillance. You know the ins and outs of surveillance. Where do surveillance investigators like to sit? What is the sweet spot to be at? When do they go out? How do they operate? If there are multiple investigators, how do they work together? And the list goes on and on. Now, you can use this knowledge to your advantage as a counter surveillance investigator as well. You can use it to your advantage as you sell those services. As a general rule, we charge more for counter surveillance than regular surveillance due to the potential complications that are inherent to conducting counter surveillance and the levels of expertise that we have on both sides, surveillance and counter surveillance. Remember, surveillance investigators are often very aware of their surroundings, so the counter surveillance investigator must be doubly aware of their surroundings. If the PI follows your client and you're always right behind your client, this is going to be very obvious as well. If you're right behind the PI who is right behind your client, that's going to be very obvious as well. You need to discuss with your client what the objective of the counter surveillance is. Is it to prove potential stalking by an ex-spouse? If that's the case, then you want to stay as covert as possible. If it is to see if somebody is conducting surveillance on your client and intervene in an attempt to dissuade the PI from further surveillance, then a more overt operation may be needed. Here are some simple rules that you'll want to apply while conducting counter surveillance for your client. In a typical counter surveillance case, you will be watching your client at their home, their place of employment, school, daycare facility, some other location that is more routine for them to be at, and the PI can expect them to be there at specific dates and times. For simplicity, we will assume we are working a child custody case where our client believes that her ex-husband-to-be is having her surveilled on a regular basis when she has the children to try to catch her doing bad things. In this case, you might decide to set up surveillance at her residence. But wait, don't just do it the same as you do regular surveillance. First thing you want to do is get in there and study that neighborhood even more than if you're conducting surveillance in there. But you want to do this when she's like at work or somewhere else, so there's less likelihood of a PI sitting in the neighborhood waiting for her as you are snooping around the neighborhood. I would usually try to go out several times and do this, and I grab video as I drive through the neighborhood. Now, I have multiple dash cams on my vehicle pointing both front and back and in different directions in my vehicle, so I can then go back and review that video and get a real good view of everything in great detail. Now that you have a good idea of the neighborhood setup, you should identify the sweet spots for surveillance. Where are the most likely places that PI would want to sit to ensure that he gets a good tail and obtains video? Which way might he be pointed so that he can expect to exit the neighborhood and follow your client? Next, work out a travel plan with your client. When would be the most likely time for surveillance to occur? Well, if the suspicion is that her ex wants evidence of what she is doing when she has the kids, then a follow to work may not be that important. However, if he wants to know what daycare that she takes the kids to, then an early morning follow to work might be the perfect scenario. Let's go with the latter suspicion. He wants to know where she's dropping off the kids in the morning when she goes to work. This is more typical to at least start with in most cases. I usually see clients that want counter surveillance both early in the day, well into the evenings when they have plans, and weekends as well. Now, if your client has any security cameras, doorbell cams, things like that, see if you can get remote access for those surveillance cameras. They can and should change their password once the case is done for their safety. If they don't, then perhaps consider adding this on as part of your intel gathering, recon, and your counter surveillance procedures. You can get a doorbell cam these days fairly inexpensively. You can set it up through your client's Wi-Fi and maybe position it by the garage door so it looks like a remote access point for the garage door. This gives you eyes on the street, and most have a very wide angle view so you can see up and down both ways on that street. Now make that travel plan with the client. She will leave at 7 o'clock in the morning with the kids. The car is going to be in the garage. She's going to load the kids up in the garage. She's going to start her car, then she's going to open the garage, and then she's going to take off. She should also exit the neighborhood the same way she always does. No surprises. This will keep the surveillance PI on his toes as he has to react immediately. This immediate reaction is what you're going to be watching for on the camera. Now you should be stationed somewhere outside of the neighborhood or on the exit route that she's going to be taking so you can see anybody who is following her. But keep in mind, you are on surveillance, so you'll want to be hidden too so the other PI does not notice you. Now your client has passed you and has left the neighborhood. Whatever you do not just jump on her tail. I always sit and I count to 10 slowly. I know this can seem like an eternity, but it gives the PI a chance to catch up and follow her out of the neighborhood. You also have to consider that the PI may not be in the neighborhood at all. If the PI has intel and knows that she always takes a specific route every day, then a surveillance PI might be sitting somewhere else and waiting for her. As you follow, you need to keep your distance. Since you know what route she's going to be taking, then you can stay in a different lane and stay back a ways. Maybe even pass her sometimes and let her pass you. Your main objective is to watch for a vehicle or vehicles that are always in the area, especially one of those obvious PI surveillance vehicles. You know, neutral colors, dark windows, sun shields always down. You know the type. Here is where having multiple dash cams come in really handy. You're grabbing video of everybody in front of you and behind you, which you can use later as evidence, and you can view that video later to see if there was something that you missed. Now, when the client is approaching, let's say the daycare center, I like to go ahead of her and get there in time to observe everything. Who comes in the area after her? Where do they park? Do they get out of their vehicles? Do they drive by slowly as if they're identifying the address or the location or obtaining some video? When she leaves, do the same as at home. Wait 10 seconds and then go. You know the route that she's going to take, so you want the PI to get a good tell on her again as she leaves. Usually in a case like this, once she gets to work, the morning would be over for that PI and he will pull off. Now, let's cover those important tips really quick. Make sure you know the neighborhood inside and out. Make several trips there and get video or photos to review as you plan the case. Have a stationary video camera installed somewhere on the client's property that you can see directly in front of the residence as well, up and down the street on. Don't sit on the house like in a normal surveillance unless you absolutely have to. When your client leaves, have a plan for a quick exit. Communicate with your client. Make sure this is done covertly and safely, like with earbuds or the speakerphone. Use that camera that you installed for intel to see what days might be the best. You always see a particular car pulling in on certain days at 6 a.m. and nobody ever gets out of the car. Work it multiple days to obtain video of a pattern once you know the surveillance is real. This tells the judge or the court that this was not a one-off thing. It tells them this is a habitual thing that the ex is doing. You will have to identify that PI, so you need plates and photos and video of him or her as well. I would not confront them in most cases. Rather, just let the client's attorney subpoena them to court